Hey folks, hi, I'm Keith Shue. I'm an electrical engineer. I have gotten to know Steve pretty well. We live not too far away from each other, I guess, but we're both very much concerned about what is happening in our state, what the future of our state's going to be with the massive proliferation of some of these things. So like I said, I'm an electrical engineer. I just threw this slide in here a moment ago, but I kind of want to show it. Steve got me thinking. When I was younger, I lived in Florida. Okay, lived in Florida for about 20 years, and I was actually quite involved with some of the mainstream environmental organizations. I was an engineer, but I was also an environmentalist. I'm still an environmentalist, by the way. But these are the kind of things we were fighting. In Florida, it was just a rapid proliferation of strip malls and housing developments, basically taking over the natural world, the natural landscape. And when I came up here, I kind of realized there was this other fight going on about fracking, high volume hydraulic fracking. That was a big topic back then. And so you had environmental groups kind of arm in arm with folks who wanted to protect their rural lifestyle to stop these things from happening. So to me, it's ironic, as an environmentalist, it's ironic that we're going to consider these things sprawl, but we're not going to consider this stuff sprawl. Does that make much sense? I don't think it makes a whole lot of sense. So, like I said, I was involved in some of the mainstream environmental groups for some time in Florida, and when I came up here, but I'm also an electrical engineer. I know something about how the grid works. And so when this became the thrust of efforts in the state, I had to say, folks, you're not getting it right. You're kind of losing your mission here, because yes, we should do something about climate change. I do think it's real. I think we should do something about it, but let's not destroy the environment in the process of doing it. So anyway, that's a little bit about me. But so I want to talk a little bit about how we got here. Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. That's the piece of legislation that Steve mentioned, and I think it was passed with some good intentions of dealing with climate change. But like Steve said, it was a strong arm tactics. Basically, people deciding what's renewable, what kind of solutions are allowed, which ones aren't, and not with a whole lot of understanding about the way the grid actually works. And that's a concern. So you had these folks clapping when they passed the legislation. Not everybody was clapping, but so the legislation basically, Steve said this already. 2019, that was our mix in electricity. 2030, we're supposed to have 70% renewables, which has a very strict definition: wind, solar, so forth, and then 100% carbon-free electricity by 2040, and the pie gets bigger because there's more demand because we have more loads. If we all convert to electric cars and heat pumps and so forth, a lot more electricity is needed. So that was the overall goal. And like I said, these folks were celebrating when the thing was passed, and the Climate Action Council was put together, and they made a declaration that wind, water, and sunlight can power most of the state's economy by 2050. So, as an engineer, I have to think, well, I'm not sure that's going to work. So these folks were celebrating. Not everybody was celebrating. A lot of people aren't happy about the direction that's been taken and the approach that's been taken as this happens, and the overriding of local communities. This is what folks are concerned about. It's what all you guys are concerned about. I know that. I don't have to tell you guys this. Steve already talked about it, what the Office of Renewable Energy Siting is doing, overriding home rule, preempting seekers, so forth, depriving local governments of adequate tax revenue when these things are forced down your throat. And even telling NYPA that NYPA is now is being told to build these intermittent facilities too that aren't going to contribute to our reliability of our grid. Like Steve said, the New York Bar Association exacerbates the ever-present upstate-downstate rural divide. The thing is, it's not just communities that are affected. It's not just the environment that are affected. There are people, hardworking people, that are affected by this too. When the Climate Action Council came up with their scoping plan and they had to get public hearings put together on it, this is what the public hearings looked like. You had a lot of folks in the labor community who were very concerned about what is this going to do for their jobs? I know a lot of these folks who are in the pipe fitter industry, the steam fitting industry, they're very concerned that their good paying jobs are going to be replaced with basically having people come in, unbox solar panels made in China and then prop them down on land. That's not where the good jobs are at, and they know that. 80% of the solar manufacturing chain is associated with China. So yeah, maybe there are jobs in China, but there are not many good jobs here with that. And so, the overall plan that was put forward is this. What you're seeing is a massive ramp up of these resources, solar, wind, and battery storage and so forth, to replace fossil fuels. And why does it ramp up so much? Well, some of it is because demand is going to grow. That's understandable. But a large part of the ramp up is because of the underperformance of these particular resources. There's something called capacity factor. Okay, a nuclear power plant can run all the time, or almost all the time. A hydropower plant has also a very high capacity factor. How about solar? Solar, like Steve said, we're competing with Alaska and Washington for being one of the worst places to make solar work. And as far as wind goes, like Steve said, there's wind resources in the country, but they're not so much here. There are some here, but it's mainly out in the Midwest. So this isn't a great place for these things to be working. And that's just the reality of it. And the fact of the matter is, it takes up a lot of land. When it's inefficient, when it has low capacity factor, it means you need that much more, but to make the same amount of energy. And when you compare different resources, it's just very, very land intensive when we're talking about solar in this case. And there's misleading here. It says direct impacts of wind looks like a smaller number. Look over here. When you consider the land in between, where people live, there are impacts associated with that too, even though that's not exactly where the turbine is. I have an illustration of that. This is the Alley Cat wind project, and what you're seeing here is the landowners that have leased their properties and where wind turbines are going to be sited. But the impact radius to folks who live in the area basically covers everything in between too. So that's pretty significant. This is out near where I live, and area of Herkimer County, very large project being proposed by Terrigen. And there's a beautiful historic Russian Orthodox monastery there. They're being inundated because some of this land is being leased. If you put wind turbines on it, everybody's impacted because of that radius of influence. So material intensity, I think Steve touched upon this too. When you look at different forms of energy, folks think, oh, well, wind is solar. Well, the wind is free, the sun is free. It doesn't have a whole lot of, it's not an extracted resource. It's actually a very extracted resource because it doesn't last very long. You got to keep on replacing them, and you need so much of it. So there's a lot of money that goes into those things. I'm going to try to speed through these. Large-scale solar, what does it mean in terms of numbers? The scoping plan was identifying upwards of 500, 600 square miles of land. You break it down, it's about 21 square miles lost every year to glass, copper, and steel for solar. That's about nearing the size of Albany or the size of Manhattan. Wind, large impacts too. I think Steve covered the numbers on this. And these are large facilities. I mean, this is one of them right here. This is what's being proposed in the area where I live. Those tiny little green things down here are trees. Just to let you know, these are big facilities.
Big trees.
Yeah. So offshore wind, significant in deployment required there to add up to what the state thinks it needs to meet goals in this way. Transmission, how much transmission you need? Well, if you're talking about solar and wind, you need about 2 to 4 times more transmission than if you're talking about other types of energy generation. I'll skip past this for now. Storage. Obviously, the wind doesn't blow all the time, the sun doesn't shine all the time. You're getting very low capacity factors, so you need more of the things you have to build, and then you have to move that energy from when you're getting it to when you actually need it, so you need lots of storage, right? Well, how much storage would you need? This is the biggest battery plant in the world. It's called Moss Landing in California. You need about 100 of these things in New York to come up with the amount of storage that NYSERDA thought you'd have to have. And I think many of you know what happened to Moss Landing earlier this year. That's what it looked like, and it got worse. So, I mean, these things can catch on fire. Even once you consider storage, once you consider transmission, once you consider the original resources themselves, wind and solar, there are going to be times when you don't have wind, you don't have sun, and your batteries are depleted. So even when that's the situation, you still have to have a firm backup source of electricity too. Add that to the equation, and you really see that you're coming up with something that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, something that's not very efficient. How much of this backup generation? Well, about as much capacity as our existing fossil fuel plants. So it's kind of looking like a Rube Goldberg picture, you know, where you take a relatively straightforward problem, make it as difficult as you possibly can. So that's kind of what it's looking at here. What we need to have is reliable energy. We need firm energy that's there, meaning that it's there when you need it, 24 hours a day. That's what industry needs, that's what society needs. That's not what you get with intermittent generation. So we need baseload energy. Consequences of not having that, you end up being like California. California, you know, they shut down their nuclear, or some of their nuclear. They put a lot of money into wind and solar. They're still burning about as much gas as they were before. They haven't really made much progress, and now they're suffering from blackouts and really high electric rates. California, Germany is kind of the poster child for how to screw up. This is the carbon intensity of Europe, and what you're seeing here is Germany in the middle there. Brown means it's still pretty carbon intensive, even after they put so much money and effort into wind and solar. Meanwhile, you got France next door using carbon-free nuclear power, and some of the cleanest air in Europe. So it's ironic how efforts don't translate into results. Here in New York, you don't have to look across the ocean to see what not to do. Here in New York, we shut down Indian Point. Remember when that happened? Well, fossil fuel use went up. A lot of the folks were saying, oh, we're going to replace that with wind and solar. It didn't happen. In fact, emissions went up, electricity rates went up, 1,000 skilled union jobs got lost. Pretty sad situation. And we're going backwards. Since the passage of the CLCPA, we're actually burning more fossil fuels than before because we're not making the right, wise type of decisions. It kind of came to a head last year. July 2024, NYSERDA kind of had to admit, look, this isn't working. That 70% renewable goal, that's not going to happen. Why they gave excuses about supply chains, infrastructure. Some of these are things are things that we told them, we warned them was going to happen. Well, it did. You had a pretty scathing report by Tom DiNapoli, the comptroller of the state, who said, NYSERDA, you not only screwed up, you really screwed up. You were ignoring how much this is going to cost, what the cost is going to be to ratepayers. You were not using correct data, even when NYSERDA told you what the right data was, you didn't change it to adjust for that. A lot of things were not considered. And then you had reliability needs assessment coming out of the state from NYSO itself saying, look folks, we are running the risk of blackouts in the not too distant future if we keep going down this path of trying to do it with intermittent generation. So I'll say that I think the good news is some things are starting to change now. And I think that was largely because of a letter that was issued back in July of last year. It was issued by business leaders. It was issued by labor leaders. It basically said, Governor, we'd like to do something on climate change, but you're killing us here. This is going to destroy the economy, and it's not going to actually achieve your greenhouse gas reduction goals either. And you're stepping on communities. We can't be doing that. And so the letter was very good. I'm not going to read all of this. We need to be thinking about nuclear. We need to be thinking about other ways of approaching this. These are all the folks that signed. To her credit, I want to give credit where credit's due. The governor held a summit in September of last year, a future energy summit, where for the first time she admitted things aren't working. We've got to take a different approach. We've got to open our eyes to other possibilities, including nuclear. We talked about, they had the right people at the table this time, including Micron, a big energy consumer that's going to be building a semiconductor factory here. They're going to need energy. They're going to need reliable energy. We got a plan for that. So some positive things happened. Nuclear was put on the table as a possibility. A blueprint for consideration of the technology was put out there. Comments were received on that. A master plan was put out relating to that. A consortium with other states. Always states all around us are investing in nuclear, so we need to get on board or we're going to be left behind. So that started to happen. There was an RFI put out there to anybody in the industry who wants to get involved in this technology. And the RFI was also targeting potential host communities, willing host communities. I think this is absolutely critical. The approach taken here on nuclear is what we should be doing for everything. Basically, communities that are willing to consider nuclear, yeah, maybe we'll have new nuclear in those places. But if you don't want it, then you don't have to have it. I wish that approach was being pursued for the other things that we've been talking about here today. I'm getting near the end, but NIPA is going to be involved potentially with advanced nuclear as well. I do want to say, in terms of changes that are happening, a draft energy plan came out. For the first time, NYSERDA was saying, look, we're not going to meet those lofty goals. We have to scale it back to something that's more in the real world. They came out with a draft document, and they came out with a different set of, a different pathway. This is the picture I showed before. With their new assessment, they're saying, well, we're not going to meet the lofty 85% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. We're not going to use police powers to kick people out of their combustion vehicles and make them force them to drive electric cars. We can't do stuff like that. So we're not going to have the same total greenhouse gas reduction drop. And so what does that mean? It means you're not going to need quite as much of the stuff. That's in the new draft plan. There are still problems, though, with this new draft plan. Actually, some significant ones. And I just want to briefly highlight a few of them. They're showing a massive, magical production of offshore wind still happening between 2030 and 2035. That we're going to catch up in that time frame. I don't think that's going to happen. You folks here aren't going to like this, but when you compare this adjusted plan to the former plan, they didn't reduce the amount of onshore wind. In fact, they made it go up a little bit. So it's actually, that part actually got worse a little bit. So we have a ways to go in order to prevail upon the state of the direction we need to be in. What they did acknowledge in the new draft plan is that this analysis is somewhat premature because they were basing it off of assumptions of the first quarter of 2025 before some of the direction from the federal government changed in terms of production credits and ITC investment tax credits, and before the governor made the initiative about the additional nuclear. So they're going to be looking at those things and hopefully adjusting this picture. I've done my own kind of back of the envelope calculations of what it might look like if you added more nuclear into the picture, and you can see that you're starting to get something that begins to work. You know, you're basically replacing firm fossil fuels with firm nuclear. Okay, that can actually make electricity, reliable electricity that we're going to need. And so maybe we're onto something here, but it's going to take a lot of diligence from everybody. I do have to tell you that just recently, about a week ago, there was a lawsuit that was issued by some of the mainstream environmental groups saying, Governor, it doesn't matter. You got to follow the CLCPA that we passed. Whether it's physically possible or not, you got to adhere to the law, and the CLCPA is the law, and the judge agreed with them. So it was kind of bizarre. The judge was agreeing that you got to enforce something even if it's impossible to do. You know, the laws of New York aren't going to trump the laws of physics. That's the bottom line. But you know, if that's going to be appealed, the governor has said she's going to appeal that, which is good, I think, under the circumstances. If she doesn't prevail, then we're back to fantasy land of something that's not going to work. So, you know, we all got to be engaged in that process. Again, I hope was going to appeal that. I think that needs to be done. This is my last slide. You know, demand is growing for energy. Realistically, we're going to need a diversity of solutions. You know, there is a place, I don't want to trash renewables completely, because I actually do think there's a component role for them to play in part, but it's got to be balanced against other things. Firm, reliable electricity. Fossil fuels, you know, it checks off some of the boxes, but you've got carbon emissions, you've got air pollution. Solar and wind, you don't have the reliability, but you know, at least in the direct impacts, you don't have air pollution, carbon emissions. Hydropower is great. There's not a whole lot of room to expand that. There checks a lot of boxes. So I think we're going to need a diversity of solutions to get us there, a combination of things. I think we can meet our energy goals, but it's going to have to take compromise. It's going to take compromise from people working on both sides, all parties, coming together to figure out how we're going to meet the needs of society, how we're going to try to address climate change, and how are we going to move forward. So that's it. Thank you very much.